Hi, I'm Kevin Sparenberg, and I want to talk to you about how certificates work, specifically with regards to physical security IoT devices. My background is primarily in the IT space, where I was a network engineer, systems administrator, and a bunch of other stuff in between. So I like the deep details. However, my goal in this discussion is to explain the overarching concepts of certificates in an easy to consume format. That said, I should preface this discussion with a warning. This is going to get very nerdy at times, and you are free to jump around. With that in mind, I've added some chapter markers to this video in case you want to skip sections or double back as you grow in your understanding. Last thing before we jump in, even though I'm going to go into some of the specifics of how certificates work with your IoT infrastructure, what it does for you, and why you should care, this will not be an exhaustive discussion of every point. This is merely a primer so you can have informed discussion with your internal IT teams. After all, meetings are most productive when everyone understands the underlying framework. And I think that's enough preamble. Let me tell you a little bit about certificates, how the concept applies to your physical security infrastructure, and why you should care. As a member of the physical security team at your organization, it's your mission to protect the company, its people, and their product. A big part of this, even if you don't consciously think about it, is protecting personally identifiable information, or PII. If you're unfamiliar with the term PII, don't worry. It's a term that's gained momentum within the IT space over the past several years, but has ramifications for all people who work with technology at any scale. Basically, PII is anything that can uniquely identify an individual. Think broad strokes like social security numbers, full names, driver's license numbers, email addresses. But for our discussion today, I'd like you to also consider some of the lesser discussed options like video and still images. In my opinion, a picture of me is even more personally identifiable than an email address. When we're speaking about PII or anything having to do with physical security, I think it's safe to say that we can all agree that keeping this data away from unauthorized parties is good. Encryption is one of those ways, since it prevents unauthorized parties from seeing the actual data. The big buckets when discussing data encryption are encryption at rest and encryption in transit. Even if those unauthorized parties gain access to the raw data, it'll look like garbage or what's called ciphertext. In today's world, keeping data that should be private is paramount to organizations, not just for compliance reasons, but for protection of corporate data, assets, intellectual property, and the employees. Any discussion about encryption always leads to questions like what data should be secured, who should have access, how are your physical security devices storing data, are all endpoint-to-endpoint communications encrypted? Can you validate that? If you're audited, can you prove you're using end-to-end encryption? If your IT team engages with the service of a penetration tester, can you be sure there's nothing for them to exploit? If your company has a red team, are you sure your physical security devices aren't susceptible to stream hijacking? I'm hoping that even if you don't have an answer for these questions right now, you'll have a better understanding of why these questions are important for your organization and how certificates can help you address some of these concerns. We need to dispel a myth. Physical security is IT security. If you have physical security devices on a computer network, you are working together with IT and are responsible for being a good citizen of your corporate network infrastructure. This 100% does not mean you need to be an IT professional. Your organization already has those, but it does mean you should be aware of the areas where your team and IT overlap. Security is a defense in-depth discussion. Physical security professionals already know this because it's baked into the way that they think. But when we talk about IT security, this may be a little bit more difficult to comprehend. But I like using castle architecture as an example. Yes, I'm serious, and you will agree with me if you just think about it. You've got to cross a moat, and if you don't drown, you've got to scale the outer curtain walls. And if you aren't riddled with arrows, you've got to take the gatehouse. And if you aren't struck down by a sword, you've got to open the portcullis. And if you aren't covered in boiling oil, you've got to break through the inner walls. And if you aren't crushed by rocks from above, you've got to obliquely cross the infield. And if you aren't turned into a pincushion from archers, you've got to take the inner gates. And if you aren't shish kebabbed by spearmen, then maybe you've reached the actual castle and need to break into that. See what I mean? Defense in depth. Your IT team is already doing a bunch of this work before your physical security devices are even brought online. They install firewalls, build access control lists, segment the networks for specific types of work, configure user accounts, maybe implement single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. That's their job. We need to concentrate on what's important for you to do your job within the organization. For us, wanting to be good citizens of this environment, we should follow a few simple yet widespread tenets, using strong passwords and rotating them on a reasonable basis, hardening your devices by blocking insecure communications and protocols, and enforcing encrypted communications to secure your data. We've already discussed password rotation and cyber hardening in other videos, so today we'll limit the talk to encryption. When we discuss enterprise-wide encryption, we must talk about public key infrastructure, or PKI. At its heart, a PKI is simple. It manages public and private keys for your organization. We'll touch on what those key pairs are and how they're used in the next section, but for right now, just know that these keys are a way to check and validate data. The PKI does this by issuing certificates based on these keys and using them to prove that an entity is what or who it says it is. The idea of these key pairs is old, like late 1970s old, and one of the problems that emerged was that there was no one right way to implement a solution for managing and organizing the keys. The problem, at least in my eyes, with the PKI is that openness of the standards led to some interesting choices in implementation. Each vendor who has a PKI offering has the flexibility to build it in their own way. Someone once referred to the standards upon which PKI is built as stupidly Baroque, and that just feels right. Full stop. As a physical security professional, your job is not to set up nor maintain a public key infrastructure. That falls squarely in the lap of your IT or network security team, but you should have a basic understanding of how it works. For our discussion today, I'm going to keep the PKI talk very high level and only speak to the most relevant parts for you. In summary, a public key infrastructure is a way for an organization to maintain and distribute sets of public-private key pairs. So, let's discuss those. As stated in the last section, public and private key pairs are at the heart of a PKI. Each public key has a corresponding private key. It's pretty obvious from the name, but a public key is something that can be shared, and a private key is something that should remain private. With a PKI, an entity can prove to another entity that it knows something without directly sharing that knowledge. That sounds weird. Give me a second. If one person knows a password, you'd have to share that password with another person to prove that you know it. This allows any recipient to impersonate the first person by using that password. On the other hand, with an entity's public key, you can identify it by looking at the key. Unlike a password, the key cannot be manipulated or reused to impersonate that entity because it's only half of the requirement. It doesn't have a matching private key. This concept can get into the weeds a little bit, and what you really need to understand is there are only two really big buckets about things you can do with public-private key pairs. Number one, you can encrypt data with a public key and only decrypt that data with a corresponding private key, or you can sign data with a private key and anything that knows your public key can verify that signature, proving the authenticity of the content. This works thanks to an absolutely dizzying array of computer science and mathematics, and in all honesty, it's a gift that allows you and I not to worry about the math that's going on in the background, but to take advantage of the solutions provided. After all, let's let the computers do the hard math stuff, and we can just reap the benefits. If you enjoy that kind of information, I'd recommend watching Crash Course Computer Science number 33, Cryptography. There's a bunch of nuances here, but at the end of the day, I like to think about certificates like a driver's license or an employee badge. Here we've got a sample driver's license. It says that I am Kevin and this is my license number. It's been issued by an authority and it has an expiration date. Similarly, an employee badge has the same type of purpose but using different information that's important to your organization. So whenever I say certificate, you can think about these examples, but not just people can have certificates. Many entities in your organization can have them. Users, like the driver's license example, devices, computers, documents, computer code, and more. Just from this list, you can infer that there are many types of certificates and that they have multiple uses in your environment. They can be used to encrypt communication, identify endpoints, both users and devices, sign code, sign documents, protect your brand via a verified mark, and many more. But for today's discussion, I want to limit the talk to the two most common certificates you'll encounter for physical security professionals. Those are server authentication and device type client authentication certificates. We'll start with how server authentication certificates can be used to encrypt traffic. You're pretty much already doing this for web traffic without realizing it. If you've ever seen https:// in front of a web address, congratulations, you're communicating with that website over Hypertext Transport Protocol, Secure. Basically, your client computer and the server on the other end have agreed to communicate securely using a secret handshake that's unique for you and it. Technically, this does add some overhead to the communications because all the traffic has to be stamped as being from you and wrapped in an encrypted envelope to be decrypted by the server on the other end. But because of the speed at which your computer can do the math in the background to support the encryption, this process is virtually transparent. In fact, the only indication that many of us see that this work is even being done is the lock icon in your address bar. But not every site is secure, and even those that are might have invalid or untrusted certificates. Have you ever been browsing around your company's sites and run into something like this? What do you do when you see that? Do you just blanket hit accept because it's probably okay, and then you click on advanced and continue, and then you're in? I mean, after all, the address is internal to your organization, and even if the certificate isn't valid for some reason, the traffic is still being encrypted. That's good enough, right? Well, not really. What you're seeing is a site with a self-signed certificate, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This is a certificate issued by the endpoint to itself. A self-signed certificate is the same thing as me issuing my own driver's license. I'm basically saying, trust me, it's all good. What's worse is that most of these self-signed certificates have an arbitrarily long expiration, meaning they can and will be valid for many, many years. Does the certificate prove anything? Well, I mean, sort of. Is it something you should implicitly trust? Absolutely not. 100% no. No. Using self-signed certificates will still encrypt the traffic, and that's good. But they're only an interim step. They should only be used briefly when a new endpoint comes online and should be swapped for legitimate certificates soon after. Leaving only self-signed certificates on devices can expose you to multiple cyber threats. And I want to say it again slowly. The use of self-signed certificates can lead to a security risk. One of these scenarios is called a man-in-the-middle attack, and for me, this is the scariest vulnerability when it comes to physical security. A man-in-the-middle attack works something like this. You've got your camera online with a self-signed certificate and are connecting from your computer. You've been accustomed to clicking past the certificate warnings and putting in your username and password, so it's just any other day. All good so far, but then a malicious actor inserts another machine in the mix. This machine either steals the original certificate from your camera or generates its own using a similar or identical name. Unknowingly, you connect to that machine thinking it's your own camera, but it's actually the malicious actor's machine. Relying on your muscle memory, you click advanced and continue and then enter your credentials to access what you think is your camera. Some actors will stop there and just capture your username and password to use elsewhere. But a sneaky actor will then proxy through your credentials to the original camera and send back the data you are expecting to see, while also sending that information plus your credentials to another location within their control. And this isn't limited to your cameras. It could be anything with a web interface: access control systems, video management systems, network video recorders, other internal servers, pretty much anything. Like I said, scary when it pertains to physical security. You can see that self-signed certificates are less than ideal and pose a potential security risk. And we can easily combat that with certificates from a trusted PKI. Certificates are all about trusting, but verifying. In the driver's license example, if you trust the issuing authority and the license hasn't expired or been revoked, then you can trust what you see on the driver's license is valid. If you've never met me before, but trust the DMV, then you can trust that this is me. Certificates work the same way. If you've never seen the certificate before, but trust the authority providing the certificate, you can trust that certificate. There are a few layers to how a certificate works in a full PKI, but it boils down to having an internally trusted certificate authority within your organization that issues certificates. Seems simple enough. Once that trusted CA is added to a trusted root certificate authority on your computer, then anything issued by that CA can be checked, validated, and ultimately trusted. The care and grooming of the trusted root certificate store on your computer is almost always handled automatically by your IT team, so there's no need for you to manually intervene. I just wanted you to be aware it's part of this framework. Certificates for traffic encryption are standard certificates, but flagged in such a way that they're used specifically for server authentication. When speaking about web traffic and web servers, they're commonly called Secure Socket Layer or SSL certificates. A server authentication certificate is an SSL certificate, and most people use the terms interchangeably. When you want to encrypt traffic to and from a website, first you need to see if you could trust that certificate, and the process looks something like this. You connect to a website and it provides back a certificate. Initially, you don't know if you can trust it, so you must see who issued it. But can you trust that issuing authority? Maybe, maybe not. We need to check. And how do we do that? Same way as before. We see who issued it. But can we trust this one? Well, this certificate is listed in our Trusted Root Certificate Authority store. So we can trust it in anything it vouches for, like the intermediate authority, and anything it vouches for, like our web server. So this certificate chain can be trusted, assuming, and this is very important, that the dates on the certificates at each level are valid as of today. Checking certificate authenticity looks painstaking, and it would be if done by hand. Thankfully, your computer has some very optimized functions to do this work. The entire process I outlined above takes milliseconds for your computer. Now, there are some other steps that your computer does, like checking certificate revocation lists, CRLs, and validating via Online Certificate Status Protocol, OCSP, but those fall outside the scope of this discussion. Just be aware if you hear either of those terms, they're part of this public key infrastructure. Great, we can trust the certificate, but how does the encryption work? Here's your server with a known good certificate, but that doesn't mean we're encrypting the traffic. We want our traffic to and from this server to remain unique to us, and this involves building our own unique secure communications channel. Think about you adding something to your online shopping cart, but then someone else on a completely different computer somewhere starts checking out and it's the contents of your cart. Same idea. I want the communications between me and the server to be for me and the server alone. Thankfully, or maybe not if you're getting tired of acronyms, there's another protocol called Transport Layer Security which helps. We'll be talking about the most recent version, TLS version 1.3, that does basically all this heavy lifting. It starts with your machine sending over a hello packet to the web server containing a few pieces of information. The version of the TLS protocols your browser supports, a list of the cipher suites your browser supports, and a random number. The random number is actually important. The server receives this information and generates a server-side secret, basically a very long number, based on your random number and its digital signature. The server then sends to you its certificate, the accompanying digital signature, the TLS version it's choosing from your list, and the cipher suites it's choosing also from your list, and its own random number. Now the server enters a waiting state just called finished. Your computer verifies the certificate and digital signatures with the certificate authority, and using the random number you got from the server, generate a client-side secret. Your computer starts sending requests to the server encrypted using the client secret. The magic of all this is that both the client-side secret and the server-side secret will match thanks to some of that complex math we mentioned earlier. And congratulations, you're communicating securely over an encrypted channel. Anyone who happens to intercept your communication while in transit will get garbage ciphertext that can't be decrypted without the secret that you and the server are using. Even if they had both your and the server's key pairs, they wouldn't be able to decrypt the contents because of the random numbers that were used in the handshake. Just like verifying a certificate's validity, this is quick, like milliseconds quick, and is completely transparent. That's the beauty of using a PKI. You're protected without the overhead of a bunch of time wasted. It should be obvious by now that if your organization has an internal PKI deployed, there's every reason to make sure your physical security devices leverage it. There's one other type of certificate I want to discuss with you, and that's an 802.1x certificate. Unlike an SSL certificate, which is for server authentication, an 802.1x certificate is a client authentication certificate. This client-side certificate is used with Network Access Control, or NAC. Now, not every organization has a NAC-enabled infrastructure, so this may or may not apply to you, but I wanted to discuss how they work. If your environment uses NAC, these client certificates are critical to your devices being and remaining online. I've always thought of 802.1x certificates as passports. They uniquely identify an entity on your network which can be checked via your public key infrastructure. I could have an 802.1x certificate for myself as a person since I am a client on this network, but the same type of certificate can be used to identify my computer or any other device in my infrastructure. These are all valid uses, but today we'll specifically talk about the last type, for device authentication. NAC is implemented by network administrators who want to validate the devices on the network should be on your network. You can easily see the ramifications this has when it comes to network security, but it also has importance for physical security as well. Basically, an 802.1x certificate allows a NAC-enabled infrastructure to validate that any device plugged into the network is valid and supposed to be there. If we go back to the passport analogy, the network switch your device plugs into is your company's border control. It looks at the client certificate, checks its validity with your infrastructure, and then allows it to connect to the network. But what happens if you don't have a good certificate? Well, the most common scenario here is that you used to have a good certificate, but it's expired. Now when you get to border control, you are checked, found lacking, and putting in a holding space. Think Tom Hanks' character in Terminal. There are typically two results when a device's certificate is determined to be invalid. Number one, that device could have zero access whatsoever, or, and slightly more likely, the device is put into a completely different network segment waiting to be confirmed, hopefully by getting a new 802.1x certificate installed. I mean, it makes sense, right? This device is no longer allowed on my network because its passport is expired. But what if this device is a camera? Is that camera offline, even though it's plugged in and got power? Well, yeah, that's exactly what would happen. Technically, the camera is online and trying to do its job, but since it's now in this quarantine network space, it can't communicate with the rest of your physical security infrastructure. For all intents and purposes, that camera is down. Until a new valid certificate is applied to this device, it won't be released from this quarantine network. Still with me? Okay, good. Now the fun begins. I've covered what and why you should use certificates, and hopefully you're ready to start issuing some. And getting a certificate only takes a few steps, and they're pretty much the same for any type of certificate. We start by generating a certificate signing request, called a CSR, on the device or on behalf of the device, with at least a common name, which is basically a name used to uniquely identify this entity within your infrastructure. We'll send that CSR to a certificate authority for validation and certificate creation. We'll receive back a shiny new valid certificate from the CA. We'll deploy that certificate to the device, and optionally, but part of good security practice, if this is a renewal of a certificate, we'll tell the CA to invalidate or revoke the one you are replacing. Great, you've updated the certificate on a device. For the sake of this example, we're assuming your device uses the simplest form of certificate, and you can just upload that file or copy the contents of it over to the device, click save, and be done. Now you notice I added an asterisk to step 4, and this is because this is where the process gets back to that stupidly Baroque comment I made earlier. Although the concept of a PKI and how certificates work is easy, the actual formats of these certificates is where things get murky. Without getting into too many side discussions, you need to know what flavor of certificate your device supports, and if you need to send just the certificate or the entire certificate chain. Unfortunately, this can vary by device, vendor, or even firmware version of those devices. I realize I've given you way more details than you probably need, and I don't want you to panic. After all, the PKI is part of IT's wheelhouse and not yours. But knowing this information can help you troubleshoot problems with certificates on your physical security devices. Ultimately, you need to remember the steps for requesting a new certificate. Those are build a CSR, send it for approval, get back a certificate, deploy to your device, and optionally revoke the old certificates. The paper pushing steps of working with a PKI for a certificate really is just those 4 or 5 steps, and it's simple since the approval of requests is frequently automated. Normally, within seconds of submitting a CSR, you'll have a certificate ready for deployment. Here's the rub. We just did a certificate for one device. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that you're running with a fairly typical 1-year expiration. So that certificate is good from today and for 365 days. You'll need to remember to request a new certificate this time next year or the certificate will go bad. So let's do those 4 to 5 step processes for all of your devices at every site and make note of the expirations so we know when to do it again. If we request all of our certificates today, then we can just put a reminder on our calendar for next year. But think on this question. What happens when net new devices come online? If we stick with the 1-year standard expiration, they will have a different expiration from the rest of your devices. Now maybe you were thinking clever and you built a spreadsheet of device IDs, addresses, and their certificate expiration dates. Cool, you're thinking ahead. Even if your infrastructure is small and you only have around 500 devices, you can easily see how this spreadsheet record-keeping process it won't scale. Then there's the complexity of the very first step, how to generate a CSR. Not every device will have the same method. On some, it's a simple web page where you go to and you click a button to generate a CSR. On others, you need to connect to some type of web-based API. And on others still, you might only be able to generate it via the command line interface. Even after you have the CSR in hand and submit it to your certificate authority, You may encounter the same type of complexity when it's time to upload the new certificate back to the device. It's inconceivable that you can do all this work on your own. An entire team of people handling just new certificate requests and rotations wouldn't have the time to do anything else. And if I'm being frank, that shouldn't be your job, not when tools can do this work for you. This is where SecuriThings comes in. We have years of experience with the physical security devices you use in your infrastructure. We've got deep relationships with the vendors who make these devices, and we have the know-how to interact with certificate authorities from all the popular vendors. Our solution will take the guesswork out of the SSL and device authentication certificates, thereby allowing you to be secure in knowing that your devices will remain online, be secure, and protect any personally identifiable information from prying eyes. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. It's been a pleasure sharing some of the skills I gained in my IT background with you. The longer I'm in these situations, the more I realize IT and physical security aren't at odds with each other. They depend upon and grow with each other. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below. Subscribe to the SecuriThings channel to know when new content is being shared, or head on over to SecuriThings.com to start up a trial or speak with our solutions engineers about how the SecuriThings solution can help you manage, maintain, and improve your physical security infrastructure. This has been Kevin Sparenberg, and for me, to all of you, thank you for keeping us safe.